This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. When you think of fashion, what comes to mind? Vogue, The Devil Wears Prada, or models on a runway? But what about American fashion? Our guest today says it starts with flannel. Flannel shirts, white t-shirts, and blue jeans. These staples are the backbone of American fashion and the textile industries. Connecticut used to have several working mills. America's first textile mill was actually built and operated out of Massachusetts in 1787. But now, most textiles, fabrics, and clothing are made overseas. Some American makers and creators are trying to change that. They're hoping to revitalize this once booming industry. New York Times reporter and author Stephen Kuritz joins us today to talk about his new book, American Flannel, how a band of entrepreneurs are bringing the art and business of making clothes back home. And we'll also learn about the history of mills right here in Connecticut and efforts to bring back the American mill. Stephen, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And well, we're happy that you're here with us. And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Stephen, I want to start by asking, how did your interest in this subject come from? Like, where did it start?
Well, I'm a styles reporter for the New York Times, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I, cover fashion with a capital F. I don't go to Paris for the shows. I don't profile big designers. My favorite thing to do is to try to find these hidden stories and to get outside of New York and see where style and culture is happening across the country. So in late 2017, I met a man named Byard Winthrop. He's the CEO and founder of a company called American Giant. And that company was founded with the idea of making everything in America, from the grown cotton to the thread, to the sewing and cutting, to the dyeing, everything about the clothing they sell, the buttons, the zippers, everything is made here. And he started with a hoodie, and it became known as the world's greatest hoodie. And that's what he built the company on. Then he did T-shirts and jeans. And he was working his way up to trying to do a flannel shirt. So when I met him in 2017, he said that, he started to look into flannel and realized that flannel was no longer done in America, and it hadn't been done in America probably since the 1990s. He was startled by that. I was very shocked by that. As you said, flannel is this classic American garment. It's a very democratic garment. You've got the Malibu surfer and the Maine farmer, both wearing flannel shirts. We all probably have a flannel shirt in our closet, and yet it was not made here. So he set off on this quest to resurrect the supply chain for a flannel shirt, and I followed him on that quest, and that is kind of the spine of the book. That's where the book began. In one sense, I thought, this is a very simple idea. He's going to go and try to make a shirt, okay? It's a very basic mission. In another way, it seemed to say much larger things about the country, about what have we lost in terms of our manufacturing capability, what's possible to bring back, and, how do Americans feel about the trade-off that, we can no longer make a flannel shirt here, or, many other things. They're made in low-cost foreign countries, but we get, cheap flat-screen TVs or, cheap blue jeans or cheap sneakers, at big box stores. And so I wanted to kind of explore all those questions and all those issues through the prism of Byard making this flannel shirt.
Well, and we'll definitely get into those questions and talk about those implications and at what cost, really. And funnily enough, I have a flannel shirt on, and when I was putting it on this morning, I was thinking, this is no longer going to be just a flannel shirt. What I'm putting on is this conversation that we're going to have today. So this is already changing my mindset of what flannel stands for. And I think, Stephen, when we think about fashion, we often think about these big European designers, the fashion designers that you see on the runways in New York and in Milan and Paris. But it turns out that the United States has also made some big contributions to fashion. And as you mentioned earlier, and when we did at the beginning of the show, staples like jeans, flannel, and even some boots were started here in the U.S. So can you talk about how did these items come into being and become the giants that they are today?
Yeah, I mean, and I wanted we lost really from 1980 on, we basically lost the majority of our apparel and textile industry. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book is to really show people what we lost, the significance of what we lost. Before 1980, America had a really robust textile and apparel industry. It was one of the leading industries in the country. It employed millions of women and men across the country. It was, almost up there with automobiles, and entire regions, including New England and also, the Carolinas and other places. Those economies were supported by textiles and apparel. And what America really excelled at was making durable, good quality, mass-produced, mid-priced clothing. And, you think about your Levi's 501s. You think about those Carhartt workwear, Woolrich buffalo plaid coats and hunting garments, Red Wing boots, all those sort of things. They were, there was a time where you could go into a Sears or a JCPenney or your local, clothing shop in a small town and buy those goods at a reasonable price. It was not luxury fashion. And those garments, they're really well made and they're iconic. And there's a reason, for example, Japanese clothing entrepreneurs, came to America and still come to America hunting flea markets and hunting Goodwills and going to small town department stores and looking through their old dead stock to find these garments. And then they go back to Japan and recreate them painstakingly, exactly the way they were, sometimes using the machines that we, sold them because, our factories closed. So, there's a real following and a real appreciation for American style, but it almost all of it came out of this workwear. Levi's was workwear, Carhartt's workwear, Woolrich, they began selling things to loggers and lumber camps. So that's really where the tradition of American fashion lies.
Right, and it's so interesting to see this sort of globalization of that trend, and yet we are seeing less of the actual manufacturing here in the United States. And the picture that you painted was how you started your book, and it sounds like it was very meaningful work for a lot of people. It was very hard work for people, and I think you described it as it was work that used to have financial stability. There's a lot of benefits, and it's basically the fabric to American life. Can you talk about how that has changed?
Yes. I mean, that's changed the way that, many things have changed in the country, not just the apparel industry. I mean, it seems like, it's hard to, you don't want to put a hard date on it, but it seems like around 1980. Around 1980, there was this sort of push for outsourcing and offshoring. It happened at the highest levels of Wall Street and Washington. Trade policy tended to favor free trade. You started with the Reagan administration, but you also had the Clinton administration with NAFTA. Those policies continued with George W. Bush administration. China was accepted into the WTO in the early 2000s. So there was this sort of mad rush to get rid of all our industry and send it overseas, and then the benefit was we would get cheaper goods, and it would help the American consumer, and it also helped third world countries build up their industry and build up their standard of living. What was lost was, and I think if you go to a community that used to make things, that its identity was making things, and these could be a big city, a medium-sized city, or a small town, you see that there was a tremendous hollowing out, that we replaced those stable manufacturing jobs that, as you said, they were difficult jobs. You don't want to romanticize them, but in many cases, they offered financial stability. They offered benefits. They offered a 40-hour work week. They offered a kind of pride in making things and a craftsmanship and an expertise. And we replaced a lot of those jobs with the service economy, where you might work at Amazon warehouse, or you work someplace where you part-time work because the company isn't going to give you full-time work because they don't want to pay you benefits. So, I think we all know, we've all seen these communities, we've all seen what's happened, and that happened in apparel too. And, it happened in New England, it happened in the Carolinas and other places that really had a deep tradition in making things. And in the book, I still find a few communities that, are doing this, and I write about them. And I focus on, all this went away, but I wanted to focus on that 2% of people that are still here, that are still doing it, and figure out how they had survived and who was it that had survived, and what qualities do they possess.
And we're going to get into that 2% in a little bit, but I want to ask you an obvious question first. Can you define for us what exactly is flannel? Is it a fabric? Is it a print? Is it both? What is it?
Well, I'm not, even after spending 4 years on this book, I am not a super technical person. I mean, flannel is a type of fabric, but you think about the man in the flannel suit. Okay, that's sort of, I think that was the title of a novel or a movie back in the 1940s or 50s. The gray flannel suit. Okay, so that gray flannel suit is not a tartan. It's not a pattern like that. And in America, flannel is synonymous with plaid. The terms are interchangeable. Flannel likely originated in Wales. They had an abundance of sheep. They had cold, damp weather. Flannel was kind of a natural, wool. Flannel was a natural garment for that. In America, the tradition seems to begin, or at least to sort of taken off, with Woolrich, which was founded by John Rich, who was an English immigrant. He had worked in the mills, textile mills in England. He came over here and he founded Woolrich in 1830. And as I say, he was selling his garments to lumberjacks. And, a designer at Woolrich came up with this buffalo plaid. It's likely based on a Scottish pattern, a tartan pattern. We all know that. We recognize it. It's the red and the black checks. And, it's probably one of the most iconic, instantly recognizable designs in fashion history. As I talk about in the book, and as Bayard quickly discovered, flannel is not so simple. We all have it. We all own flannel shirts. We all take it for granted, but it's a complicated thing to make. Especially the way Bayard was doing it. He wanted to make a yarn dyed flannel shirt. And that means that each individual yarn is dyed first before it's put on a loom and woven. Today, sometimes what a fast fashion company will do is they'll stamp a plaid pattern onto a bolt of fabric. And Bayard wanted to make it the old-fashioned way, and it's this really interesting mix of engineering and art. You need the engineering skill to mix the color the right way and get that color onto fabric in a correct way. You need the artistic skill to color match and see how things are, lay out, the warp beam on the loom, and to design the pattern in the first place that makes it, appealing. So flannel is a commonplace thing, but it is also very complicated.
Well, I love that description of it's sort of a marriage between science and art, really. This sounds like creating flannel/plaid. Thank you for the clarification, Stephen. And we mentioned earlier that Connecticut was home to several textile mills, and listeners might know some of them. We also spoke to Jamie Eves, who's a senior curator at the Wyndham Textile and History Museum, or also known as the Mill Museum in Willimantic, about this. Well, we're going to hear a quick clip from Jamie.
So southern New England is sometimes called the cockpit of the Industrial Revolution in America. It's where the Industrial Revolution began, and the Industrial Revolution began around textiles. As we get into the second half of the 19th century, southern New England and adjacent areas of New York and New Jersey are still we're centered on a textile industry. Tens of thousands of employees at any one time during the height of the industrial era, really until maybe the 1960s. People of color could not get hired really in most of the industries in Connecticut unless there was a real shortage of labor. So it's a racism that we would recognize in the South, but it was also going on here. It just was more subtle. We've got at the Mill Museum hundreds of photographs of early mid 20th century mill workers. They're all white. So I think that's kind of an important thing to say. The earliest mill workers were farm kids, local farm kids who were coming in to supplement farm income, or farmers who just didn't have enough land to be able to continue on the farm, and so they were looking for a better way of life. So it's a local Yankee population from the beginning of the 19th century on up until the 1850s, and that's when the first immigrant wave who were Irish start to arrive. And they start to work in the mills, followed by French Canadians in large number, Poles, and all sorts of other people. In Willimantic, we've counted 26 different ethnic groups that worked in the local mills here, and I'm sure we missed some. People lost hands, fingers, arms in some of the machinery that was there, particularly the carding machines. And if you're working on the spinning frames, that didn't happen, but you were breathing in an awful lot of cotton and wool dust and lint, and you'd have breathing problems quite often by the time you're in your 40s. They call it brown lung or white lung disease, and it's analogous to the black lung the coal miners got. So it could be miserable. Also hot and humid. They deliberately made it humid because humid actually is good for the thread, for the fabric, and the thread won't break as much.
You are listening to Jamie Eves, who's a senior curator at the Wyndham Textile and History Museum, or the Mill Museum in Willimantic. And so, Stephen, Jamie was able to really paint us a picture, sort of the historical aspect of how this came about in about 2 minutes. Can you respond to what we've heard from Jamie and talk more about the history of the industry in the North and the South? Was this industry developed in part because of slavery?
Well, he brings up some very good points. I mean, the apparel industry and the textile industry has a troubled history, as do many industries, in America. But the thing was that, because it's such labor is so necessary. It can't be easily automated.
Right.
Even today, you can't have a robot sew a cable knit sweater. And so because of that, the apparel industry was constantly in search of lower cost labor. So it started in New England, and then it went to the South because there was cheaper labor in the South, and because the Southern the mill owners were less willing to unionize. And so there was non-union labor. And then it goes from the South to Mexico and Central America, and then it goes from Mexico and Central America to Asia. And now that wages are rising in Asia, there's talk about the apparel industry going to Africa. So this is an industry that's in ever search of cheaper labor. And that's one of the big problems with the industry. And that's a big reason why the industry went offshore. So that's absolutely the case. I mean, the flip side of that is, and that is the history. The folks I've focused on in the book are trying to do business in a very different way. And I talk about, we get into this, but I talk about this town in Alabama, Fort Payne, that was the sock capital of the world. 1 in every 8 pairs of socks were made there. Up until the early 2000s. And this is a town, I describe it as like a Silicon Valley of socks, where everything revolved around sock making, and there was an incredible amount of entrepreneurship and innovation. And, when you spend time in that community, as I did, you see that the mills in that town, often, would give money to the Boy Scouts, or they would give, they would hold blood drives, or they were a real kind of texture to the community. So there were really, two ways of doing business. There was an exploitive way, which happened, in many cases, certainly in the 1800s and early 1900s, and then it was a more sort of benevolent way of doing business, which the town of Woolwich, which I write about in the book, worked that way, and Fort Payne worked that way. So there are definitely kind of two sides to the coin.
Well, and you mentioned earlier with the trends of fast fashion and also quality of fashion have become more prominent, and obviously there's been a lot of designers that have latched on to this sort of high quality narrative, but we're also talking about cost here. Whenever we're talking about high quality, it often means sort of boutique pricing, like $300 for a pair of jeans, or $200 for a scarf. So I got the impression that the people you were interviewing weren't really looking to do that. Can you help us understand what's going on there?
Yeah, so as I said, America's claim to fame with apparel was this mass-produced, mid-priced clothing, and that was really affordable to the average worker. When the industry went away, American-made clothing, in some respects, was replaced by more of an artisan model. And so you have, I read about a guy in the book. He was in Oakland, California, in the aughts, and he bought these old machines, and it was him in this workroom making these jeans himself painstakingly, and the jeans ended up being $400 a pair for that reason, and that's just unaffordable to most people. And it's sort of boutique, and Bayard of American Giant describes it as elitist. It's just and that is one model of very small batch American made. But, Bayard is trying to do, he's trying to kind of be the modern Levi's or the modern Wrangler and make clothing that, yes, it is more expensive than the clothing that's made overseas and sold in big box stores, but it's still reasonably priced. And it's still, and the idea is there's quality behind it. So if you buy the American Giant hoodie, you may have that hoodie for 10 or 15 years because it's not going to fall apart after 3 times through the wash. Gina Locklear, the sock maker in Fort Payne, Alabama, her socks are a little more expensive than, the 3-pack of socks that you would get at Target. But, they're organic fashion socks, and she's trying to make them sustainably, and she's trying to pay an American wage, and she's trying to do things in the right way. And yet she's making them, this is not a small batch thing. I mean, she's making them in a mass-produced way. So that is the model that people are trying to bring back.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to seeing more of those models making their way back. You've been listening to our guest, who is Stephen Kuritz, the author of American Flannel, How a Band of Entrepreneurs Are Bringing the Art and Business of Making Clothes Back Home. And the book was just released this week. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation about the textile and clothing industry and the people working to change it. We'll also hear from a local company working to bring back this craft. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been talking to Stephen Kuritz, who's the author of the book American Flannel, and he's also a reporter for the New York Times. And just about a year ago, we spoke with Lucian Tonti, who's the author of Sundressed, Natural Fabrics and the Future of Clothing. Ahead of today's episode, we spoke with her about what it would take to bring back the textile industry to the United States.
There's definitely a groundswell movement of people who are really interested in the return of local manufacturing and who believe that it's really, key to changing the fashion industry and making it more sustainable. And it's just a long road, like it's not as simple as, oh, we're going to reopen this factory, whether that is a cotton mill or gin or, a denim factory, because the state of manufacturing in the US is similar to in Australia and is similar to the UK, where it's been a few decades now that we've been seeing that manufacturing go offshore. Like probably we could put it to kind of back to 1990. So it's been 3 decades, which is enough time to lose the skill set and to, for the training programs to fall by the wayside. And so every time we kind of set an agenda that's like, we would like to see the return of linen processing or flax processing into linen, in these countries, or we want to see the return of hemp, because I know that's something that comes up a lot in the States as well. It's really complicated. We need investment to build infrastructure that is, at a level that matches the big manufacturing countries in the world like China and, other nations in the global South. But it's not enough just to say, okay, well, let's find the capital and buy the machinery, because you also need a workforce. Mm-hmm. And then you also need, everything that comes along with that. So training programs and skill sets and knowledge and expertise. If we want to be realistic about the return of local manufacturing, we need to be ready to compete and buckle in, because it's going to take a couple of decades.
And joining us now is Jacob Harrison Long, who's the president of American Woolen Company that's based in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Thank you very much.
And you've been listening to the conversation with Stephen and also what Lucian has to say. And Stephen has also mentioned that this whole process is very complicated. And like Lucian said, it's not just, let's open up a building and start doing this. Can you respond to what Lucian has said, and anything else that you would like to respond to in terms of what Stephen has to say?
Well, without a doubt, the infrastructure is lacking currently in America. But I tell a lot of people that if you look at what the craft beer industry did in America, they really switched the dialogue from focusing on volume to focusing on value. And at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really wants to compete with Asia or the lower cost countries. Here at American Woolen in Stafford Springs, we tend to try to compete against the European luxury brands. And I think a lot of this whole issue has really been focused on the commoditization of what was otherwise a specialty product. Textiles, apparel, footwear, anything consumer driven for 300 years was always considered a specialty. And that specialty referred to the material quality, the material integrity. Wool from some of the ranches out west, wool from the local ranches, cotton. Another thing was the manufacturing. Another thing was the design and the branding. The American manufacturers did an amazing job at turning what was a specialty into a commodity. And that pretty much continued through the 20th century, and that commoditization can only go lower. I tend to focus on how the Europeans were able to take this consumer product and maintain the specialty status of it. And at the end of the day, it's really that specialty status, which is probably the future of America's textile, apparel, footwear, and consumer good industry. The ability to really focus on how the specialty, it's what consumers would pay a premium for. As long as it's a commodity with cheaper materials, cheaper manufacturing, and bland design, it's going to be relegated to a commodity status. Here at American Woolen, we take every one of those 4 points and really try to hit it home. The wool comes not from some ranch, comes from Wyoming. We can pinpoint the ranch. The manufacturers here in Stafford Springs, we operate 3 mills, 2 of which date from the 1850s. Our design is New England as New England can be, and our branding is trying to take that New England to a higher style.
So tell us about your journey into American Woolen, and how did this all get started for you? Where did your interest in textile and clothing begin? Because that's not your OG story.
So I spent 25 years working in investment banking in Europe, and I really saw firsthand how the European craft manufacturing movement was able to really take root. The Europeans, I found, especially in manufacturing, really didn't focus on the process, they focused on the product. Where the American manufacturers focused on efficiencies, the Europeans focused on effectiveness. And it really was seeing that firsthand. And then 2013 came along, and a friend of mine mentioned that his Italian client had a wool textile operation in Connecticut, and inquired if I knew anybody who'd be interested. And I guess, as my wife will attest to, I'm probably somebody that's dangerous because of my level of passion and energy. And 5 round-trip tickets, 53 hours of paid consultants, and 6 months of due diligence. And I sold my house, my car, and convinced my wife to move from Italy to Connecticut and buy a mill. I don't think it's right for everybody, but I
Sure.
do believe we're onto something pretty great.
Well, I not as dramatic, but my husband and I also packed a small car and drove across from the West Coast to the East Coast in a couple of months. So I to a certain extent, I can understand where you're coming from in terms of that passion, and that's such a that's a huge change for not just yourself but your entire family. But can you also talk about what exactly was about textiles that attracted you, and can you also talk about how textile can really represent traditions of New England?
So I think the idea of textiles pretty much was the idea of the consumer facing aspect of the product. People tend to know about designers and designers' lifestyles, but if you look at somebody from across the room, the first thing you notice is the textile, the color, the print, the pattern. So it really was a textile in the textile industry. And I think what really was curious is the former owner and operator of American Woolen was Italy's probably finest textile maker, which is now part of the French luxury good conglomerate Louis Vuitton. So I think knowing that Loro Piana owned and operated this mill in Connecticut, I knew we were really buying into the best. And in terms of your inquiry about textiles, textiles are a medium to express traditions. Yes, textiles also keep us warm, as do clothing. But I tend to look at what textiles in New England and the difference in our New England-based textiles, different color palette, different weight, different material integrity, as opposed to textiles worn in Texas or Florida or the southern part of America. So I think a lot of it was just trying to look at the adventure of what a textile mill could do in Connecticut. And I tend to tell people we're not made in America, we're made in Connecticut. And I think that's what the modern consumer is looking for. A lot of people say that the brands that are thriving recognize that people no longer buy what you make. They buy who, what, where, when, why, and how you make it. And I think at American Woolen, we represent all those pretty well.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that you're able to get wool from a Wyoming ranch, and you can pinpoint exactly where your materials come from. So, can you tell us more about where do you get your materials and fibers?
So American Woolen currently sources a lot of its natural fibers out of the US. It's quite funny because when we started this adventure in 2014, by 2018, 71% of all of our textiles went over to China to be turned into a garment to come back. And what COVID was able to help us understand was that there is an American contingent out there that wants American made. I guess I'm pretty pleased that 100% of the textiles we manufacture at American Woolen go to American smaller manufacturers. But in terms of where we get our fiber from, we are pretty much limited on our capacity. We do have a yarn making operation and we have a full vertical mill, but due to our amazing capacity, a lot of the yarns are sourced out of, a lot of the wool comes from American ranches, but in certain situations, we are forced to import yarns just because we don't have the capacity at American Woolen. We're hoping to change that. But the good thing about it is we really work with the upstream ranchers out west to understand how they can get a better clip. I guess I tend to tell people the joke about this is upstream, we have 5 million sheep that roam our prairies. 70%, 70% of the wool is put into a container to go to China. And downstream, the American consumer imports $5 billion of wool, textiles, and apparel. And I guess our role is to try to facilitate that flow of American wool fiber to the American consumer.
Well, and it sounds like getting this industry on the ground is really I mean, we've talked about it so much. It's very complicated. It's very difficult, and you are coming up against a lot of friction, including infrastructure and also capacity of getting materials locally or within the U.S. So you're the only company left in Connecticut that does this, and one of the only companies in the U.S. Can you talk about why do this on a day when so much of this can be done offshore?
I think that, again, the craft beer industry really taught me that what an industry can do to stimulate growth and stimulate job growth. And I guess, why do I do it? I tell people that unlike a lot of other industries, a wool mill touches the four critical systems to build an economy. An agricultural system, we do it because we work with the climate smart agricultural practices out west with some of the ranchers. Industrial system, we're helping to support this textile industry that Stephen mentioned was responsible for minting more millionaires in the 19th century than any other industry. Then on a social system, as Stephen mentioned, a lot of these mills that left New England when they went down to the South, they didn't build the mills in the center of town. They built the mills 10, 15, 20 miles outside of town. Well, my mill is right in the center of Stafford Springs. I'm across from the police station, from the town hall, and the local church. At the end of the day, it's our mission to really support Stafford Springs. And then on environmental system, American Woolen produces wool, which is a biodegradable, sustainable fiber. Yes, as an industry, there are a lot of hurdles, but I think if you step back and take a larger viewpoint, I think it's pretty tremendous what we're trying to achieve here in Stafford.
And with so much, I think progress going on, and hopefully with a lot of movement and momentum going forward, what are you hoping this industry will look like in, say, 10, 20 years?
A big thing is, again, taking the page off the craft beer industry. We didn't create bigger, much bigger scale breweries. We really focus on bringing beer back to the local community. And at the end of the day, what I could only hope is that people look at American Woolen as a laboratory for trying to create other textile mills across America. America really excelled in scale manufacturing, and I think that scale really took away the specialty of our product. Well, the hope could be that more textile mills, more apparel manufacturers try to recreate these ecosystems that really built this country between the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And again, you just need to travel to Europe to see how the Europeans are doing it to understand that it is a viable route forward.
And Stephen, I want to bring you back real quick before we go to break. We're listening to Stephen Kuritz, who's the author of American Flannel. Can you respond to what you've heard from Jacob, and also what are you hoping this industry will look like in 20 years?
Yeah, he brings up many good points. One of them that I just want to address quickly is this idea of, we got into this mindset of growth in the fashion industry. Multiple people told me when I was reporting the book that the kiss of death is when a fashion brand goes public, because then it's all about growth and, delivering to the shareholders. And the conversations I had over and over again with Gina at Zaccano, Bayard, or, and listen to Jacob talk, it's about quality. And the conversation needs to come back to quality, not growth. It's about the product. It's about making that product the best you can make it for the consumer, not about, can we open 50 new stores next year? And I applaud Jacob for putting quality at the front of his business.
Well, thank you so much for that. With us today is Stephen Kuritz, who's the author of American Flannel, and Jacob Harrison Long, who's the president of American Woolen Company that's based in Stafford Springs here in Connecticut. They'll both be staying with us, and after the break, we'll talk about finding locally made clothes and how the pandemic impacted this industry. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're hearing from Stephen Kuritz, who's the author of American Flannel, how a band of entrepreneurs are bringing the art and business of making clothes back home. With us still is Jacob Harrison Long, who's the president of American Woolen Company in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. So we've been talking about the past and future of the clothing industry here in the United States. About 65% of U.S. consumers often look for products made here. And yet, only 2% of all the clothing we wear is actually made in the United States. That's according to the Alliance for American Manufacturing. So, Stephen, I want to start this conversation with you. Are you seeing a desire among consumers to buy locally made products? We've been talking a lot about bringing sort of like beer back to the U.S. A lot of people are buying craft beer, and I think even local coffee roasters are doing more of the same trend as well. But it seems a little harder to find locally made clothes.
Yeah, I think there is a movement towards this. In the 90s, everything was about sort of chains. I mentioned in the book this idea of if the Olive Garden came into your town, or if you got a mall, you would hit the big time. And then this thing started to shift in the mid 2000s. I think certainly after the financial crisis, and people started to wake up and realize, what have we lost with this, commodification? What have we lost with mass consumerism? People started to turn towards locavore food, as Jacob said, craft beer. And I think, the heritage movement in clothing, where a lot of these heritage brands, Woolrich and Filson and Carhartt and others, were rediscovered. There's been a whole generation of people who have awakened to, what we've lost, and are trying to make better choices to be better consumers. And I also think the pandemic really brought a lot of this home. I mean, what was the first thing that we had a shortage of in the pandemic? PPE. We did not have the ability here to make PPE for first responders. And so we're watching television and we're seeing doctors and nurses in the wealthiest country in the world wearing trash bags to hospitals. And it was a real wake-up call that we need to be able to make necessary things, the things that underpin life. And, I would argue that clothing, food, shelter, clothing is a necessary thing. And so I do think there's a sense that the consumer is more attuned to this. Having said that, we often tend to find it in wealthier coastal places where the disposable income allows the person to make the decision to pay more at the farmer's market, or to pay more for, the American Giant hoodie rather than, the hoodie at Walmart. And I don't entirely fault the American consumer for that. I mean, the American worker has not had a wage increase in real terms in something like 40 years. And so people have limited amount of money, and, they have to cut corners, and perhaps, buying the cheaper pair of boots or the cheap pair of jeans is a way to do that. So, I think part of it starts with, workers being paid more so that they can make those kinds of decisions and spend a little extra money and support their communities.
And Jacob, would love to have you respond to what Stephen just mentioned, especially with the pandemic really sort of spotlighted the wake-up call that we need to have ways to manufacture our own PPE and et cetera.
I really don't know much about the PPE industry. I make fine worsted and woolen fabrics, but what I can say is, if you look at how the European luxury good groups have been able to focus on America, America's been the largest market, or was the largest market, of European luxury textiles, apparel, and footwear for the last 40 to 50 years. I think what the American consumer wants is better design, better materials, better branding, and better design, materials, manufacturing, branding, those four legs. I think if an American brand can offer those four legs, and that's all made in America, I think you'll find a willing audience. The biggest problem has been the American manufacturers really trying to substitute cheaper materials and cheaper manufacturing and hoping for the same payoff that the Europeans are enjoying. Again, there is a willing consumer out there. We have 330 million Americans, and they're probably willing to spend that money if they could get better design. In terms of that discussion about the worker, I agree with Stephen 100%. Those years in Europe really taught me how wonderful it was to be a consumer and dining with producers. It's kind of hard in America to ever sit across from a producer. We're all a bunch of consumers trying to consume more. A big hope in what we're trying to achieve at American Woolen is to have a dining set where your producer will be sitting in front of your consumer. It may be paying a bit more for your textiles and apparel, but it's buying better, but buying less. The American household budget dedicated to textiles and apparel has dropped precipitously over the last 40 to 50 years. I think the argument is if people were struggling to pay 50 cents for a can of beer back in the 1980s, they're now gladly paying $10 for a bottle of beer because they know the brewer from a local Vermont craft brewery. I think we can replicate that same thing in textiles and apparel.
Well, and Stephen, we got about 2 minutes here, but I would love to give your thoughts on this. Jacob just described his sort of changing perspective as he's able to learn more about textiles and sitting down with producers. Can you talk about how has writing this book changed your own thoughts about fashion and clothing?
I was never someone who, bought a lot of fast fashion, but it has made me much more aware of what goes into a product, and particularly clothing. One of the amazing things in this process of reporting and writing the book is to be in these factories and see how things are made. And when you understand the work that goes into it, the expertise, the decades of skill and the thought, and all the energy that goes into making something, you have a greater appreciation for it. After Bayard spent that year making the flannel shirt and he was able to resurrect the supply chain, I got this package in the mail one day from American Giant, and it was a flannel shirt, the very flannel shirt that I had spent a year chronicling, the process to make. And, it almost glowed in my hands in a way. I just understood all that had gone into that, and I had a much greater appreciation for it. And, the other thing is I just try as best I can to, be thoughtful about my, consumption. I wear Zakano socks, and I know that I'm supporting Gina, and I'm supporting her workers, and I'm supporting her workers' families, and I'm supporting the town of Fort Payne every time I buy a pair of Zakano socks. So I'm just much more intentional about my purchases now around clothing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Stephen. You've definitely changed our minds and our perspectives on how we purchase our clothing. Now, thank you so much for being with us today, Stephen Kuritz, who's the author of American Flannel, How a Band of Entrepreneurs Are Bringing the Art and Business of Making Clothes Back Home. Thanks, Stephen, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And also Jacob Harrison Long, who's the president of American Woolen Company that's based in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
And to keep us updated on the re-emerging industry, I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.